James Cartlidge, 80 years after the end of the Second World War, should we still be marking that moment?
Oh, definitely. I think it's incredibly important. In fact, in many ways more important than ever, because the key thing about this year, we had, as you know, the 80th anniversary, both the end of VE Day and VJ Day, which marked the end of the wars in Europe and in the Far East 80 years ago. And the thing, having attended both parliamentary debates about that, the thing that's so moving is that everyone talks about the end, inevitably, but sadly, of the living link to those who served, as in the end of the generation. Now, there are still some, and we saw them yesterday at the Festival of Remembrance, but we have to preserve that memory once the living link has gone. And so I think it's actually even more important, because the purpose of these events is to learn the lessons, isn't it? And that's why, why do we stand up to Russia and support Ukraine? So that we don't experience that ever again.
Well, when you say we don't learn lessons, one of the lessons we perhaps need to learn is to make sure that our armed forces are up to scratch. They are war ready. The Chief of Defence Staff I spoke to this morning said that they had been hollowed out, and that happened on the watch of your government.
This phrase, hollowed out, came from Ben Wallace, who I had the privilege to serve under, an excellent Secretary of State.
The previous Secretary of State, yeah.
But one, Grant Shapps, the previous. Ben, that quote very clearly says under successive governments, which is always overlooked when it's used politically, and it wasn't meant to be used politically. It was making an honest observation that, in 1985, when Gorbachev became Soviet Premier, and it was the beginning of the end of the Cold War, spending on defence was 5% of GDP, and every year since it has fallen because, and this is true of governments around the world, particularly in Europe, we thought we had a new era of peace, and that peace dividend was spent not on defence, it was spent on health and other things.
But you did have 15 years to fill the pot.
Well, OK...
14 years.
14 years. If you want to talk about the finances, when we came to power, the budget deficit was over 10%. Now hold on a minute. They had just over 4% Labour when they took office, right? We had over 10%. It's an extraordinary position in which we found ourselves. You have to make some very difficult decisions across all departments in that situation. Having said that, you judge us by what actually happened in practice when we were challenged. Just made this point, just as we did with Mrs. Thatcher in the Falklands. And the way we stood by Ukraine, we were the only country at the beginning that stood by them, the only European country. The weapons we provided helped them to stay in the fight. And frankly, if they'd fallen early and Russia had conquered Kyiv and the rest of Ukraine, you'd have had a crisis like 80 years ago on our doorstep in Europe. So I'm very proud of what we did. All right.
This week you asked the Deputy Prime Minister 5 times, I think, about wrongly released prisoners. Now, strictly speaking, he was right to decline to answer your specific question, which is about asylum seekers, since Brahim Kadur Sharif, the man that was recaptured with the help of my Sky colleagues, wasn't an asylum seeker. But basically, you messed up the question, didn't you?
Well, when you say he was right, first of all, he's the Secretary of State. I'm merely, standing in for Kerry Badenoch as a member of the shadow cabinet at that point.
Don't do yourself down.
Wait a minute.
You're a dispatch box.
Yeah, but all I knew was we had a tip-off that there was another such case. We didn't know for certain. You can't know for certain unless you're running the department. And he stood up and answered my questions. He had at his fingertips the facts, and he's in front of Parliament. He has a ministerial code to be transparent, and he didn't answer the questions at all. And my judgment is that was a profound mistake and a discourtesy to Parliament, notwithstanding what it means for his adherence to the ministerial code. The fact is, and this is why I asked it, the public were extremely angry with what happened in the case in Epping, and I simply wanted to know, were there any other cases like that so that he could reassure the public, and he chose not to do so, and he chose not to do so when he knew the facts.
Are you saying that he misled the House, which is a resigning issue, I think?
Well, he couldn't have misled the House because he didn't answer the question at all. I mean, he made no attempt to. When I stood up and asked a very straightforward question...
But I think you just said that he broke the ministerial code.
Trevor, I said the question about the ministerial code is because there is a duty of transparency, right? I didn't say he misled the House, because he didn't answer the question at all. But what is shocking, and I didn't know this at the time, he admitted it later, he knew about the other case, and he also had a statement ready for Parliament at his hand. The idea that he stood up in front of Parliament... Hold on, Trevor. He stood up in front of Parliament knowing the facts and chose not to share any of it when I was asking him to reassure the public is shocking.
If we're talking about being straight with the public, though, I'm just trying to get you to say what you took from that exchange. Did he mislead the House? Did he, in your opinion, break the ministerial code? Should he resign?
So, on misleading the House... to the extent that he withheld facts that he knew full well because they were in front of him, he certainly didn't answer the questions and was not transparent. So I think under the ministerial code there's a question. Now, the ministerial code is overseen ultimately the Prime Minister. Okay. That's a question for him, and I think it's a really important one. We ask these things...
So you want the ethics advisor to launch an investigation?
I certainly think this has got to be looked into, and we will be raising it when the House returns. We've got Justice Questions is the first event when we return to Parliament on Tuesday. But I think it's the willingness to avoid the question at all, when what I was asking him, on behalf ultimately of the country, Trevor, is can he reassure people watching there aren't any more cases like this? And he knew there were, and he didn't answer.
I'll tell you why this is all a bit mysterious. Why didn't you just ask him what you just said? That are there people who shouldn't be wandering about the streets? You had this tip-off. It all seemed a bit murky. Why didn't you just ask him directly?
I did ask him directly 5 times, and he chose not to answer at all. I asked him very directly. And I asked him about accidentally released, someone who'd been let out of prison unintentionally. And the reason for that is because, as you know, Trevor, the number being released accidentally has soared. And when we had that in Epping, the public were outraged, and I wanted to ask, on behalf of the public of our country, for him to reassure us there were no other cases like that. And he knew there were, and he chose not to say anything.
I'm interrupting you because you made that point twice before. Yeah. But let me put this to you. Do you bear some responsibility, or your government? You cut funding during the years of austerity. I don't think anybody can argue about that. Experienced staff left, which I'm sure wasn't the intention, but that's what actually happened. I can show you. In 2017... the budget went down from 2010, and it fell to a low point around about 2016. Okay, it's recovered a bit, but nowhere near where it was. And the effect of this, I'll show you another graph. Was actually I can't show you that graph, but I'll tell you what it says. In 2017, the median length of service for prison staff was 12 years. By 2021, that had declined to 4 years. The budget cuts meant that there were great churn, and prisons were employing inexperienced people. Wouldn't it do something for honesty in politics if you simply acknowledge that actually some of this is your responsibility?
So, 2 parts to this. I already said at the beginning of the programme about the fact that we inherited a budget deficit over 10%. That's a country threatened with bankruptcy. We had a note left, there's no money left. Labour even admitted it, right? If you look at that spending...
Yeah, you made a choice.
But the public often don't understand the detail. So let me explain. The difference between a deficit of 4% or so that Labour inherited from us when they won the election in 24 and what we inherited from them in cash terms now is £160 billion. That's the entire NHS budget.
We discussed this a lot in our programme.
But that's why this happened.
Viewers understand that, but you made a choice about where you were going to impose austerity. And you asked me to be honest. And here it is in prisons.
Trevor, you asked me to be honest, so I'm telling you why it happened honestly, and because of the finances of the country. In terms of the outcomes, the policy outcomes, what does this translate to? We were speaking about accidental releases from prison, right? Now, in every year that we were in office, the average number of accidental releases from prison was about 60.
But you're swerving the question I asked you, which is, do you accept any responsibility for the fact that the budget cuts that you chose to make meant that there were less experienced staff in prisons and they were bound to make the sort of mistakes we're seeing this week? Do you accept no responsibility at all for that?
I am accepting the fact that we had to make those difficult decisions. You've just said you chose to make, implying that we got to office, hey, let's now cut all the spending.
Yeah, I've asked you if you take responsibility. Your answer is 3 times it's somebody else's fault.
I didn't say that. I said I take responsibility for the fact we had to make very, very difficult spending decisions because of the state the country's finances were in. You're implying that we somehow voluntarily launched this so-called austerity. We didn't. didn't. We didn't have the money to fund departments in the way we wanted.
If I may say so, you're accepting responsibility for what somebody else did before you came into office, and you're saying that actually it was nothing much to do with you.
OK, I've said we had to cut spending. So I'm being honest with you on air. Okay. Why do we have to do it? Because the country was on the cusp of bankruptcy. It had a budget deficit north of 10%. That's very, very serious for the country. Now, but you didn't let me finish the point about outcome. Because
wouldn't mind quickly.
Because, as I said, the reason I raised that case in Prime Minister's questions is because the idea of accidental release from prison is incredibly serious. They averaged about 60 every year. We were in office 262 such cases in Labour's first year. But you're asking me about the truth. They're the stats, and that's what matters.
James Cartlidge, thank you for your time this morning.
Welcome.